He used to wake up every morning at the same time, even after retirement, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, staring at nothing in particular and wondering why the urgency never left him. For 40 years, his days were defined by schedules, responsibilities, and a quiet belief that once the work was done, peace would arrive naturally. But it didn't. Instead, there was an unfamiliar emptiness, not dramatic, not painful, just persistent, like a question that refused to be ignored. He began noticing how often his thoughts drifted back to moments he dismissed as insignificant, conversations he rushed through, evenings he sacrificed for productivity. What unsettled him wasn't regret, but realization, the understanding that presence had always been available, yet rarely chosen. As time passed, he stopped filling his days with unnecessary tasks and started allowing silence to sit beside him. In that stillness, something softened. He realized that identity doesn't disappear when roles end, it simply waits to be rediscovered. The pressure to be useful, impressive, or productive slowly loosened its grip, replaced by a quieter attentiveness to simple moments, light through a window, the rhythm of breath, the ease of doing nothing without guilt. He no longer measured his days by accomplishment, but by awareness, by how honestly he showed up to each moment. Life didn't suddenly become clearer, but it became lighter, less about proving value and more about recognizing it had always been there, quietly, long before he learned how to notice. She noticed it first in the mirror one morning, the way her face looked unfamiliar for a second. Not older, just different, as if it carried stories she hadn't fully acknowledged yet. For years, she had been the one others relied on, the listener, the organizer, the quiet constant in everyone's life, and somewhere along the way, her own voice learned how to wait. It wasn't neglect exactly, more like postponement, the habit of telling herself there would be time later. But later arrived without ceremony, bringing with it a subtle restlessness she couldn't explain. She began questioning choices she once defended without hesitation, realizing how often she had said yes to preserve harmony rather than truth. The realization wasn't sharp or bitter, just steady, like a light turning on in a room she'd been living in the dark. Slowly, she started reclaiming small decisions, speaking more honestly, resting without apology, allowing disappointment to exist without immediately fixing it. What surprised her most was how little collapsed when she stopped performing her role so carefully. Relationships adjusted, some deepened, some grew quiet, and she learned that distance wasn't always loss. With time, she understood that self-abandonment rarely announces itself. It disguises itself as responsibility, kindness, and strength. And as she became more present with herself, she didn't feel rebellious or selfish, only clearer, more grounded, aware that honoring her inner truth wasn't a disruption of her life, but a return to it. The call came on an ordinary afternoon. Not urgent, not dramatic, just a familiar voice asking a simple question he couldn't immediately answer, and that pause unsettled him more than the question itself. He realized how rarely he checked in with what he actually wanted, how instinctively his responses were shaped by expectation rather than honesty. For most of his life, decisions had been made efficiently, logically, always in service of stability, and that structure once felt reassuring, but now it felt narrow. As he replayed the conversation in his mind, he noticed a quiet pattern, how often he had chosen certainty over alignment, how easily comfort disguised itself as fulfillment. The awareness didn't arrive as regret, but as recognition, a sense that something essential had been deferred too long. Over the following weeks, he began slowing down, not dramatically changing his life, but paying closer attention to the subtle resistance that surfaced in small choices. He noticed which obligations drained him and which moments brought an unexpected sense of ease. Saying no felt unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable, but with it came a surprising calm. He wasn't dismantling his life, he was adjusting his posture within it. There was relief in accepting that clarity doesn't demand immediate action, only honesty. and as he allowed himself to listen without rushing toward resolution, he felt a steadiness grow, not rooted in certainty, but in the quiet confidence that he could meet his life as it unfolded, without abandoning himself in the process. Every evening, he sat in the same chair by the window, watching the light fade across the street, realizing how strange it felt to finally have time and not know what to do with it. For decades, his life moved in clear sequences: work, responsibility, repetition, and the structure left little room for doubt. But now, with fewer demands and fewer distractions, thoughts he once postponed began to surface. He noticed how often he measured his worth by usefulness, how deeply the habit of productivity had shaped his sense of identity. The absence of pressure didn't bring immediate relief. It exposed a quiet uncertainty about who he was without constant obligation. Instead of resisting it, he began sitting with that feeling, allowing it to exist without judgment. Days grew slower, and in that slowness, awareness sharpened. He started noticing small satisfactions he had overlooked before: the comfort of routine without urgency, the ease of unstructured time, the simple act of being present without direction. What surprised him was how dignity returned when he stopped trying to replace one role with another. He didn't need a new purpose to justify his days. He needed permission to let them be what they were. Gradually, the pressure to fill every hour softened, and with it came a gentler relationship with himself. Life didn't regain its old momentum, but it gained something quieter: a sense of sufficiency, a recognition that value doesn't disappear when usefulness fades, it simply changes its shape. She found the box while cleaning a closet she hadn't opened in years, a small cardboard container filled with photographs, letters, and objects she once believed she'd keep forever. Sitting on the floor, she moved through each item slowly, surprised by how familiar and distant they felt at the same time. Each memory carried a version of herself she no longer inhabited, choices made with certainty that later softened into complexity. What stayed with her wasn't regret, but the realization of how much effort she once put into becoming someone specific, someone she thought life required. As she sorted through the past, she noticed how expectations had quietly shaped her path, how often she adapted rather than decided. The years hadn't erased disappointment, but they had reduced its authority. There was a gentleness now in the way she held her story, less judgment, more understanding. She recognized that some dreams were never meant to be fulfilled in literal ways, but to guide her attention for a time. Letting go of the objects felt symbolic, not as loss, but as release, a permission to stop carrying versions of herself that had already completed their role. When she closed the box, she felt lighter, not because the past was resolved, but because it no longer demanded to be preserved. In that moment, she understood that growth sometimes means honoring what was without insisting it continue, allowing space for the present to exist without comparison or explanation. He realized something was wrong the first morning he woke up exhausted despite having nothing urgent to do that day. The fatigue wasn't physical, it was quieter, deeper, the result of years spent carrying responsibilities that were never questioned because they felt necessary. For most of his life, reliability had been his identity, the one who showed up, handled problems, and kept things from falling apart. Letting go of that role felt unthinkable, even as it slowly hollowed him out. What surprised him was how invisible the imbalance had been while it was happening, how easily endurance disguised itself as purpose. As his pace slowed, he began noticing the subtle cost of constant availability, the way his own needs had been deferred until they felt unfamiliar. Instead of pushing through, he started pausing, allowing discomfort to surface without immediately suppressing it. The shift wasn't dramatic. Nothing collapsed. No one accused him of failure. What changed was internal, a recalibration of boundaries that had long been ignored. He learned that responsibility doesn't lose its value when it's chosen consciously, and that strength isn't measured by how much you carry, but by how honestly you assess what is yours to hold. In releasing the pressure to be everything for everyone, he discovered a steadiness that felt less like obligation and more like presence, a way of living that no longer required self-erasure to feel meaningful. The first thing he noticed was how quiet the house felt after everyone left, a silence that didn't feel peaceful yet, just unfamiliar. For years, his sense of direction had been shaped by others, their needs, schedules, expectations, and when that structure dissolved, it left behind a space he didn't know how to inhabit. At first, he tried to replace it quickly, filling his days with distractions, projects, and noise, anything to avoid sitting with the uncertainty. But the quiet persisted, waiting. Over time, he began to understand that the discomfort wasn't emptiness, it was unpracticed presence. Without the constant pull of responsibility, his thoughts slowed, and questions he'd avoided for decades resurfaced gently rather than urgently. He noticed how often he had mistaken movement for meaning, how easily busyness protected him from self-reflection. As he allowed himself to stay still, something shifted. The silence became less threatening, more spacious. He began recognizing subtle desires that had long been muted, preferences he never voiced because they didn't fit into the roles he played. There was no dramatic reinvention, just a gradual return to himself, one quiet afternoon at a time. He learned that stillness isn't a void to escape, but a threshold, a place where identity can loosen and reform without pressure. And in that calm, he discovered a steadiness that didn't depend on being needed, but on being present, aware, and willing to meet life without the armor of constant obligation.
He caught himself rereading the same page for the third time, not because it was difficult, but because his attention kept drifting to thoughts he didn't usually allow space for. The book rested open in his hands as he sat alone, aware that his life felt fuller than ever and yet strangely unfinished. For years, progress had been his compass, moving forward, improving, reaching the next stage, and that momentum once felt essential. Now it felt habitual, almost automatic. He began noticing how often he planned the future while standing inside the present, how rarely he allowed a moment to exist without assigning it purpose. The awareness wasn't unsettling at first, just curious, like discovering a habit you didn't know you had. Gradually, he started loosening his grip on constant evaluation, letting moments arrive without immediately categorizing them as useful or wasted. With that shift came a quieter relationship with time, one less governed by urgency and more by attention. He noticed simple details he once overlooked, the weight of stillness, the rhythm of breath, the comfort of not needing to move on immediately. The sense of incompletion didn't disappear, but it softened, no longer demanding resolution. He understood that life doesn't always offer closure, and that meaning doesn't require constant advancement. Sometimes it reveals itself when forward motion pauses, when awareness replaces ambition, and when presence becomes enough without explanation or reward. The realization came quietly one evening as he stood in the doorway, lights off, listening to the house settle into silence, aware that nothing in particular was wrong, and yet something had undeniably shifted. For most of his life, he believed meaning would announce itself clearly through achievement, recognition, or resolution. But standing there, he understood how rarely life works that way. What he felt wasn't loss, but a soft detachment from the urgency that once drove him. He no longer needed every experience to lead somewhere or every decision to justify itself in hindsight. The past felt present but no longer demanding, the future open but not insistent. He noticed how much of his identity had been built around effort, around becoming, and how little space he had allowed for simply being. Letting go of that constant forward pull didn't make life smaller, it made it more accessible. Moments no longer passed unnoticed, and silence no longer felt empty. There was a growing comfort in not resolving every feeling, and allowing uncertainty to exist without treating it as a problem.
He realized that fulfillment doesn't arrive as a final state, but as an ongoing recognition, a willingness to stay present with life as it unfolds without rushing it into meaning. And in that awareness, standing still in the quiet, he felt a steady alignment, not because everything was complete, but because he was no longer resisting where he was. He realized he no longer remembered the exact moment things began to change, only that one day the noise inside him wasn't as loud as it used to be. There was a time when every pause felt uncomfortable, when stillness triggered the need to adjust, improve, or move on, but now those impulses had softened. Life hadn't become simpler, yet it felt less demanding, less insistent on being managed correctly. He noticed how his attention shifted from outcomes to experiences, from future plans to present sensations, the weight of a breath, the quiet of an early morning, the way time seemed to slow when it wasn't being measured. What once felt like uncertainty now felt like openness, a space where meaning didn't need to be forced. He no longer searched for a version of himself that felt finished or complete, recognizing how exhausting that pursuit had been. Instead, there was an acceptance of continuity, the understanding that life unfolds without offering final clarity, and that this wasn't a failure of understanding, but a feature of being alive. The urge to define himself through productivity, consistency, or explanation gradually faded, replaced by a steadier presence that didn't rely on validation. He wasn't detached from ambition or memory, but no longer governed by them. Standing within this awareness, he sensed that fulfillment wasn't something waiting ahead or hidden in the past, but something that appeared quietly when resistance eased, when attention settled, and when he allowed himself to be exactly where he was, without needing the moment to become anything else.